This is an analysis of a brief extract from Stave 1 from A Christmas Carol, looking at the character of Scrooge. And this particular extract is useful if you are trying to write an essay on Scrooge and how he changes through the novel. If you're trying to look at a comparison between Scrooge at the start in Stave 1 and at the end in Stave 5, or just if you're practicing your language analysis and your point evidence analysis or your petal paragraphs or whatever it is you do in school. So what you'll need is a copy of this particular extract of the text and a pen as we go through it, because we're going to look at some of the vocabulary and then look at the things you can say about it. Okay, so to start off with, we need to check what's being said and that we know what it means. So we have this opening, or these opening two exclamations here, okay? And if you're looking at the narrator, Dickens as narrator in this book, then you might want to start looking at times like this when there's something called narrative intrusion, okay? And that is where your narrator intrudes into telling the story. They stop just telling the story factually, and they start to kind of give you their opinion or their views or their ideas or their emotions. So if you're talking about the narrator, you might want to talk about the exclamations. If you're talking about Scrooge, you might say that the narrator shows how dreadful Scrooge is through the use of exclamation, because obviously if we exclaim something, it shows that there's some degree of intense emotion going on behind what we're saying. So then we move into, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, Scrooge. And this idea of a tight-fisted hand, if you imagine you clench your fist, it's so you can't get anything or taken away from you. You keep hold of everything that you've got. So it's an image of meanness and selfishness. Okay, we often say that somebody is tight-fisted if they won't pay for anything. It implies that the money is being kept tightly in their hands. And this kind of mixes a little bit, because we also kind of talk about putting your nose to the grindstone or kind of getting back to the grindstone. And if you imagine olden days where you'd have a big spinning kind of stone used to sharpen things, you know, putting your nose to the grindstone or getting back to the grindstone was an idiom, a phrase or saying for getting back to work. And so here we have the idea that he's mean, he works hard, and possibly also that he makes other people work hard, because we know later on about his clerk, Bob Cratchit, that he's very mean and very, if we use the word parsimonious, if you want a kind of fancy word, parsimonious, there is an I in there. That means kind of he's tight. Right, so it's all about trying to find the right, more formal vocabulary to describe what Scrooge is like. So we've then got a series of present participles, so squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, and these are all, you can either say present participles, okay, or you can say verbs which show grabbing. Yeah, the point is that actually he's actively either trying to take things or he's trying to actively keep hold of things for himself. So this list has that building up effect, that cumulative effect of all of those verbs. So, you know, he's not just a grasping old sinner, and we'll come to old sinner in a moment, but he's a wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. So it's all building up. This word is important if you're looking at analysing Scrooge, and especially if you've got a question that's going to talk about context, right? So to be covetous is against the 10 Commandments. So if you think of the Bible, when Moses went up onto the mountain to receive the 10 commandments from God, one of them was thou shalt not covet. It was actually thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's ox. And it means if you covet something, it means that you look at what somebody else has got and you powerfully want it for yourself. You spend a lot of time kind of assessing what everybody else has got and putting time and energy into wanting it. Obviously in the Bible, it's kind of the ox it symbolises, wanting your neighbour's assets, the important things, the valuable things. So here in covetousness, Scrooge wants everything, right? But you can also add a little bit of context in there and say he's not Christian. Okay, so this is clearly against Christian values. So he is covetous, right? And if that wasn't kind of strongly made enough, there is this idea of he is a sinner. Okay, and again, to sin is in the Christian faith to act against God, to do the things that God doesn't want you to do. And there are different levels of sin. So we have just from those 3 first exclamations here, we've got this impression of Scrooge really being mean, selfish, preoccupied with money and material things, and unchristian. So hopefully that gives you lots of ideas in how you can establish Scrooge just simply from those first lines at the start of the novella. We then move on to even more description. So the narrator says he is hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. Now, flint is a type of stone. If you Google it, you'll get that kind of grey stone that if you hit them together, you get very sharp fragments. And if you hit flint against flint or flint against steel, you get a spark. And that was the way that primitive man first kind of started to be able to light fire on demand. So here we've got the simile that he was hard and sharp as flint. So he shares those characteristics with stone, hard, sharp. But this is flint from which no steel had ever struck out generous fire. So if Scrooge is flint, he has never made a warming, a kind, a generous fire. We then, the idea of secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. So this triple here builds up exactly how isolated he is from everyone else. And secret is kind of keeping himself to himself, not sharing things. And solitary as an oyster, if we think of an oyster, think of those sea creatures which are very, very tightly kind of clamped together. If you Google a picture of an oyster, you'll know exactly what I mean. They're very difficult to open. Okay, when people eat them, they need to use a special knife to get into them because they're so difficult to prise open. Solitary, obviously they're not social creatures, they are by themselves entirely, so solitary means to be on your own. But you can put a lot more detail into that oyster comparison. So Dickens is using the oyster because it's hard, it's difficult to break into. It is self-contained, it's a little unit by itself. But also you might have this idea that when you do get into an oyster, there is this softer, very kind of delicate thing inside it. So you might talk about a little bit of foreshadowing towards in terms of looking at the end of the novella. You can also talk about the idea of a pearl. Now we get pearls from oysters. If a little bit of grit gets into an oyster, it's sharp and it irritates that squishy centre. And obviously an oyster doesn't have arms and legs just to kind of get rid of the bit of grit. It has to put up with it being in there. So it generates this mucus which coats the sharp thing that's hurting it, and it turns it into a kind of very soft, very shiny, very smooth thing that then just stays inside the oyster that isn't causing irritation. And that's a pearl. That's how we get kind of naturally made pearls. So again, we've got this build-up of the simile that Scrooge might be something that has great value inside him if only it can be unlocked, if only it can be opened. We then look at the metaphorical cold here. Okay, so we've got all of this idea of Scrooge being aligned, so being lined up with, Scrooge is aligned with cold weather. Now that's appropriate because we've got a novel about Christmas, but whereas other characters are taking Christmas as a time for joy and happiness and charity, Scrooge is mirroring, is kind of paralleling only the temperature that's there. So the cold within him, his own little low temperature, froze his old features, nipped his pointed nose. So look at the kind of plosive alliteration there, the plosive sound on the p there. His pointed nose nipped his pointed nose, so it's slightly aggressive. Shriveled his cheeks, so kind of shriveled means to dry up, to become all kind of desiccated and dry. Stiffened his gait is the way you walk when it's spelt like that. Made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out. So the cold speaks out in his voice. Now his voice grates, which is kind of to irritate. If you think of grating cheese, also you're running it down that rough surface to kind of break it up. So if something grates metaphorically, it really kind of begins to irritate you. It really begins to shred your nerves. And to be shrewd is to be kind of cunningly clever, right? Wise. It's got some connotations of wise, but not here. It's kind of canny here, a little bit cunning. So the cold actually affects all of him, the way he looks, the way he appears, how he carries himself, what he looks like, how he expresses himself. So he's actually being kind of negatively affected by this emotional coldness, by this isolation. Here, this metaphor, a frosty rime was on his head. Rime is that very, very precise kind of frost. If you get a branch, okay, in the winter and it's frosty, let me use blue for this, okay, and sometimes you notice that there's all sorts of little spikes of frost on a branch. Sometimes when you go outside, it all looks spiky. That's what a frosty rime is, okay? So it's describing the fact that his hair, his eyebrows and his chin, his beard looks like this frost. You know, he is almost the embodiment to kind of, if you embody something, then you give it a physical form. He's almost the embodiment of kind of horrible, emotionless cold. He carried his own low temperature always about him. He iced his office in the dog days. The dog days are the last days of summer. So he makes the summer cold, and he doesn't thaw it at Christmas. So we have this kind of metaphorical cold. You can talk about, you know, this kind of general reference of pathetic fallacy, where we have the emotions mirroring the weather or vice versa. And it really is kind of this extended metaphor, you know, of Scrooge equals cold. So you get all of the bad things about the middle of December and none of the good Christmas things about him. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. So again, it's emphasising his isolation. Everything from the outside doesn't impact upon him. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. So this again is kind of also kindness as well as heat. We know that Fred tries to kind of be friends with him. We know that kind of the charity collectors try and, you know, ask him for help. The little boy, the carol singers, everybody in Stave 1 who Scrooge interacts with, he isn't warmed by, or he doesn't warm to. And that's very useful if you're doing an essay on Scrooge at the beginning and ending of the novel and the change. Look for all the matching points, look for all the parallels in Stave 1 and Stave 5. Almost everything that happens that Scrooge does badly in Stave 1, he tries to fix in Stave 5. Okay, so we get the wintry weather doesn't chill him because he's already cold. No bitter wind that blows is more bitter than he is. No falling snow is more intent on its purpose. And we know that his purpose is to get stuff for himself at all times. No pelting rain. So pelting rain is driving, kind of rain that's been thrown down. That's less open to entreaty. If you're open to entreaty, then you are prepared to listen to people. You're prepared to kind of consider what they're begging you or asking you to do. Foul weather didn't know where to have him, so actually, you know, foul weather has no effect on him. He's already horrible enough. The heaviest, right? So that's superlative there. The heaviest rain and snow and sleet. And we've got this kind of repetition of and. Now you can refer to that as listing. You can refer to it as repeated and. You can refer to it as polysyndeton or polysyndactic listing. Okay, either of those will do. If you can't remember the name, the important thing to do is to go for the effect. Okay, so if it's repetition of and, great, right? So we've got these building up and saying all of these things could only say one thing, that they kind of were better than him in one respect. They came down handsomely. So they, you know, if you say the rain came down handsomely, it came down a lot. There was loads of it, and Scrooge never did. So if we apply this phrase to a person, you know, we'd say that they were generous, they were, you know, splendid, they were really, really good. Scrooge cannot be said to be that. So just in those 2 paragraphs, you can see how you can actually, for revising an essay on Scrooge, get a lot out of a little there. And it's not the case that you need to remember lots and lots. You can say an awful lot about the cold, about those first 2 lines, about the kind of use of weather and metaphorical cold, to set up an essay to really give you the detail for how Scrooge develops during the novel. Hopefully this has been useful. Bye now.